Okay, Andy, I said I'm going to really try. I'm going to really try and call you Andy and
Good,
not call
well
you
done.
not call you Dr. Staples, despite the fact that your classes 15 years ago, when I was a student at Kansai Gaidai, I would say were some of the most, not just enjoyable classes, but like some of the most enjoyable times like of my life.
That's a bit too much. But thanks very much.
I knew you
enjoyed
wouldn't
it.
accept that being a British person. You would, like, couldn't possibly do. Yes, but honestly, it was just one of those times where we were looking at businesses not just from a textbook perspective, but we really spoke about it in terms of stories and what was really happening in the world.
Yes,
and
exactly.
It just really, for me, accelerated my interest in really following, I guess, the business context of Japan much more seriously. So,
Excellent. Yeah, I'm glad to hear it.
Yes.
I think the what I really wanted to do is try to make that content really practical, so bringing it to life. So I remember sort of asking people to say, well, have a look in the media. What's going on with this company, or what's going on with this particular issue, and linking that with the class topic as well. So I'm glad you enjoyed it, and thank you.
Yeah, so honestly, there's still things today where something will come up and it will be referencing, for example, I remember there was one specific topic, it was like referencing natural resources in Africa.
Okay.
And it was specifically in a Chinese context. And I said, oh, we talked about that years ago.
Excellent.
I'm ahead of that.
Yeah.
So yes, I'm super excited to have you here today. One of the reasons why you're so early in this series of focusing on AI is because I can't imagine a world where AI exists without context, where AI exists without thinking about things from a political perspective, from a government perspective and policy. And we actually have a really special maybe chapter or an opportunity to speak to you right now because you are leading your own consultancy in that. And so even though you have a prestiged career and you did always, as you said, say what you liked, you can even say even more of what you like now that
Sure.
you're at the end of the day, you're the one signing off on things. So thank you for coming. That's a little bit of context.
Thanks for the invitation. Yeah, it's great.
Let's maybe just kind of start. One thing that that I feel most, and I'd love your perspective on, is kind of the conversations, let's say that 5 years ago, especially here in Tokyo, you can obviously speak more to the APAC region, in terms of change or innovation as an imperative. I feel compared to 5 years ago, we have a totally different temperature just around the room, despite the fact it's incredibly hot in Tokyo at the moment. But in terms of the kinds of things that people are doing, were kind of a nice to have, I would say, when we're ready, we'll get there type thing in about 5 years. And now they're like imperatives. What's your view? What are you hearing?
I think that's absolutely right. Just to focus on Japan for a while, it's actually coming up for 10 years since I was based here in Japan, and I've been in Singapore since that time. But I'll get to Singapore, Southeast Asia, and the region a little bit later, but to your sort of observation about that change in approaches to innovation, I put it more in the sort of context of the space for not doing anything has got smaller and smaller, right? As the demographic issue really starts to bite, as the global environment in which Japan operates has changed as well, the need for a digital transformation, the need for companies to become more innovative has become more and more pressing, and the opportunity to make excuses for not doing it, that's diminished. So I think you're absolutely right in that. That's something that I see for Japan as well. In contrast, down in Southeast Asia, which, as you know, 700 million people roughly in ASEAN, and you've got places like incredibly rich city-state Singapore, and you've got the massive economy or population of Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, and all the rest of it, all growing somewhere around between 4% and 6% and so on. Young populations generally in most of those places. Innovation has always sort of been lived. It's always been there, and you've seen some fantastic stuff in recent years, particularly around the type of platform economies like Grab and Gojek and Come On and so on that have developed as well. So I think there's always been a slightly, not slightly, a very clear sort of distinction between approaches to innovation in Japan and what we see in Southeast Asia, and by extension places like India as well, who've really sort of taken the ball and run with it in terms of the application of technology as they try to rapidly grow their economy and provide better lives for people as well.
Yeah, I'd love that about providing better lives. Everyone, when we hear about AI, we're obviously very focused on productivity, but one of the things that I always love to ask people when they're thinking about their AI strategy is not simply how are we making things faster, but how are we making things better.
Yep.
And one of the things that I really hope for the Business Karaoke podcast is to kind of unlock insights or comments that maybe you don't find online. So you're an extensive writer and commentator on the region, but if you were sitting down and you say, like, we had an alien just drop in here into the Design Thinking Japan offices, and they were to say kind of like, what's going on in terms of this political kind of environment, what are some things that you would say that are maybe not so obvious for outsiders? And maybe a little bit more context to that is, yes, AI is a transformational technology. However, we've gone through transformations before as humans. And so I'm also a big fan of maybe looking to the past to also move forward. So I'd love your perspective on that as well, in terms of when it comes to transformations. We've gone through so much, particularly politically, who's been friends in the region, who hasn't been friends in the region, who's come back to being friends in the region. Lots of things happening like that. What would you say is maybe the key points to kind of focus on now?
Yeah, okay. I'll try to be concise.
Oh, no, the Business Karaoke podcast is not about being concise as well at all. It's tangent central.
I mean, that historical context is critical, and you're right, go back to the Industrial Revolution, and the dramatic transformation from agrarian societies to industrial societies throughout the 1800s, the electrification of economies throughout the 1900s, containerization of trade from the sort of 60s onward, and then the IT revolution, and so on and so forth. So yes, we've had these waves of disruption and new technologies, and we've adjusted and adapted to them. There's a whole conversation about whether this time it's different, it's a fundamentally different type of technology, or no, we can actually learn from the past if we look back at some of those technologies I just mentioned there. Just thinking about the sort of here and now, I guess a lot of what I've been talking about, particularly over the last 6 months or so, is that we are in an inflection point with the global political economy. The assumptions that underpinned globalization, particularly from the sort of 90s onward, so think about the collapse of the Soviet Union, the sort of unipolar moment for the United States, the rules-based international order, the assumptions around free trade, reduce barriers to trade, open up your economies to foreign direct investment, and so on. That was the globalization that we knew, that security, peace comes from economic interdependence, and so on. The more we trade with each other and invest in each other, the safer the world will be. 2001, China joins the WTO. China's growth gets really turbocharged. The rest of the world benefits from that in terms of the products that China's making, but you start to get tensions evolving within that global political economy. And if you fast forward now to today, you've essentially got China, the world's second largest economy, the US, the world's largest economy, locked in a trade war. Some would say that we're in a new Cold War. Some would say that we're in a pre-war situation as well. We've gone from that unipolar moment for the United States on all the assumptions that we had there to more of a multipolar world, and a lot of challenges or rejections of those assumptions. Economic security is a critical issue now, or has become a critical issue. And when you bring that right down into the focus on technology, you could be thinking about semiconductors. Who makes them? Who has access to them? Where does that supply chain run? And essentially, to put a sort of cherry on that, America would like to maintain its sort of preeminence. Not just America, but that sort of broader, let's say, Western supply chain, which could include ASML, who makes the machines to make semiconductors in the Netherlands, TSMC, that makes them in Taiwan, in Kumamoto, in Arizona, Düsseldorf as well, and everybody else. Maintaining that in a Western sphere and ensuring that that Western sphere maintains some dominance or at least headspace from China as well. And China, to reverse that, desperate to become resilient in its own way, to become less dependent on the West. We've got policies like Made in China 2025, we've got the dual circulation policy and so on. So the world is sort of splitting, bifurcating into these two camps, and we're in a very different sort of emerging new world order from what we had until relatively recently. And I think this is the fundamental dynamic that people need to understand. For example, if you're an executive that graduated in the 90s, you did an MBA, you worked in a big global business.
Did all the right things.
And you built those global supply chains because it made sense under that rubric of globalization. Now you're in a very senior position. Everything that you learn is still valid to a certain degree, but there's a whole new set of issues you have to worry about. Is the company that I'm dealing with on the entity list? Is the technology that I'm who fundamentally who controls that? To give you an example, electric cars, EVs in the United States. Where does the control and guidance systems come from? Is that data being leaked back to China and the Communist Party? Well, okay, we're going to ban that technology in this country, for example. So I guess a long way of saying that I think we're in a very different emerging new world order, and that has big implications for businesses, for policymakers, and for individuals as well.
Absolutely agree. Looking to the past, being, let's say, maybe informed from the past.
Yep.
But I mean, obviously, that doesn't mean that then has to guide all of our decisions. I think there's an element of information we can take, but again, looking at strategically, where are we now? What's going on today? I remember I think it was like 1998. I was sitting in my school in Australia, and there was a mandate passed which was, we are now no longer learning Italian, French and German and any other European language. We will be learning Asian languages, and Australia began their Asian century, right? And so my school by chance was Japanese. My brother's school was Indonesian. That does not mean my brothers speak Indonesian. However, they are aware there is a language called Indonesian. I just really enjoyed Japanese. But then when I remember sitting there, and the teacher drew a map and drew a line down the middle of the world and said, "Where are we?" And we were Australia. And you're like, oh, so much of our culture is, British informed, American informed, etc. But when you look geographically, where were we? Even as a child, I remember thinking, we're on the Asian side of the world. And that was like very, very clear. Fast forward, 20 years, this is still very much true, and I think this is something that we are dealing with, particularly in, let's say, Western-friendly Asian countries, Singapore, Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, etc. How do we balance this kind of one foot in either camp type thing? And I think this is maybe an interesting issue. I don't know if there's a particular answer, but I do think it's something that is ever present now, even than 20 years ago.
Absolutely. And I think these choices, divisions, challenges are coming into much sharper focus. I mean, just to stay on Australia, so we got this agreement, AUKUS, around building nuclear-powered submarines, agreement with the UK and the United States, with Australia. That's clearly with China in mind and sort of regional security there. But we also, what was it, 2 weeks ago, Albanese was up in China, for quite a long visit, and talking about trade and investment there. And that type of issue is magnified for many countries within the region. What you hear all the time in places like Singapore from policymakers and business leaders: don't make us choose. Don't make us choose between China, our biggest trading partner, and we've got cultural links and so on, and America, our biggest investor, and the country that guarantees our security. This comes into very sharp focus when you think about the South China Sea and the fraught relations you got with the Philippines, Vietnam, China, and so on. So there's multiple overlayers. So there's security, trade, investment, culture and so on, navigating through that is increasingly complex. Going back to that old globalization, it was much easier. You didn't really have to worry about many of those issues. Now you do. In addition to running a business and keeping it successful and being sustainable and all energy, whatever it might be, you've got all of these other complexities to deal with as well.
And you also have an element of, let's say, technical literacy that's then required. Yep. So one thing that I have observed since diving fully into AI as a technology or AI as a tool has been that it's really only ever as powerful as the direction that we give it, or it's only ever as effective as the questions that we ask. And I have seen, and this is generalizing, however, I've noticed that the largest or senior leaders, particularly here in Japan, I would say have a limited, maybe not acceptance, but literacy of these kind of newer technologies. And we're seeing I don't know, I think there's like almost a word for this, but you know, sometimes like larger Japanese organizations exist by outsourcing absolutely everything, and the only thing that you actually have to do in your job is to nemawashi left, right, and up and down, and your actual work you give to vendors. I feel if we do that with AI, we're really looking at a risk, because AI is not like, how can we do something faster? So for example, we actually had a customer here earlier in the week that they were like, this is the process that we usually do due diligence, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Let's call them the 6 steps.
Yep.
And we want to now do these 6 steps just much quicker. And we said, what happens if it was 1 step, and what happens if it happened in an instant? And all of a sudden they were like, oh my goodness, because we're just looking at AI as like, how can we just do what we usually do and make it faster?
Yep.
Kind of not very, not as equally ineffective was like when we first went into the like COVID period, and everyone kind of like went online, and we tried to do regular work, normal work, but just in a computer, having regular meetings, doing all the kind of things. We just did it digitally, which was really dumb, and it didn't really work very well. So then we introduced things like asynchronous work. So we redesigned how to integrate and how to interact. So I'd love to hear, what are we looking at, for example, at a really senior leadership? They're sitting on budgets, they're sitting on people, they're making decisions on fundamentally changing technologies, but there's this kind of, you know, way in which that like the Japanese often like to outsource stuff. But I'm like, don't outsource the AI thing. That could be really dangerous.
No, I think you're right. You have to take ownership of it, because it could be fundamental to what your business becomes, and I think that becomes sort of emphasis there is it can be transformational, and think about something like telecommunications, telephones. I mean, the Alexander Graham Bell, I think it was thought that it would be a great way for people in distant areas to listen to an orchestra.
One use case.
Well, yes, but actually, there are other use cases there that emerged over time. And I think if you are looking at your company today and how it's set up, and just thinking this is another tool, and you should be thinking about it as a tool, but you can also be thinking about it as, how is it going to transform my business? What is my business going to look like in 5 or 10 years' time? How can we reimagine what we do? Where are we? Where do we want to be on that value chain? Now, this is given added impetus, I think, by the sort of commercial challenges. I hear this all the time from business leaders from China. China is increasingly going global, for various reasons, but anyway, Chinese firms are increasingly sort of moving outside. So foreign firms, particularly those operating in the region, are bumping up against Chinese firms who are highly competitive. The price point is very low, and they're capturing more and more of the value that foreign firms used to sort of dominate. So where do you go? How can you reimagine your business? What's the role of AI within all of that as well? These are pressing questions to your point though, how many people are really sort of grappling with those questions, and at what level within the organisation? I think that's an open question. What you would hope is that boards are really grappling with this, that they're posing themselves the questions, or they're getting the expertise in to say, where do you want to go? What do you want to do? How do you imagine your business? And then communicating that down to the executives for to put into practice.
And in your advisory work, are you finding that there are common themes? Perhaps it might be regional, say for example, Japan might be having certain questions, but maybe, for example, somewhere like Indonesia might have completely different questions. But in your advisory work, what are you hearing on the board level that are, let's say, really forefront in the board's minds?
So, I mean, I got to say that I do less in that type of area, but more on the sort of geopolitics of it. So the pressing issues there that I engage with are, where's the technology coming from? Who's building your tech stack? A few years ago, you'll recall, it was all, who's building your 5G system? Are you going to allow Huawei in? And many countries did, because very good, very cheap, extra service and so on. Until you start having this economic security layer, Britain is in the process of ripping Huawei equipment out of the telecommunications system because of these concerns. That was a few years ago. Now it's all around who's building your tech stack and where is it based. And what I do see is this bifurcation. So if you're in China, tech stack in China for China, and then whether in America for America or the rest of the world. For some companies, depending on what sector you're in and how sensitive it is, the answer is very clear. We can't possibly run anything on a Chinese tech stack. We're an American company in tech. We have to be doing this. For other countries, let's say in Indonesia, they would be looking at what's going to be best for them at what price point, and they have to sort of balance out the economic security, the risk of being over dependent with the access to cutting edge technology, which they can then apply in their companies, and the aggregate level driving growth within Indonesia itself. And again, this sort of brings into sharp focus, well, are you going to sort of fall into the US camp or to the China camp, or is there a third way through? European Union is trying to sort of create a sort of third way, so they don't have to make some of these difficult choices. But in this part of the world, I think traditionally they have been able to sort of split these two out, but they're getting sharper and sharper. Or perhaps not. I mean, a lot of this is based around the US and China, and we know that relationship has got increasingly fraught in recent years. But we also know that President Trump is quite mercurial. Up until, when was it, last week, NVIDIA was sort of banned from selling its latest chips to China, and now it's okay.
That's fine.
The big narrative has been America, China decoupling, de-risking. And I think that will continue, but will it be as stark as some of us thought it might be even just a few months ago? It's a very fluid time.
Yeah, and what are some, I mean, I'm always a fan of not so much the answers, but more like the questions. What are some questions that would be, let's say, of value to ask? And, the reason I'm asking is, as you said, your tech stack, your security, your data sovereignty is going to be so key. But does that mean every single country has to then go out and start building chips? This is then almost next to impossible. If you look at, different countries and where they're at, does that either grow the gap, between the haves and the haves not type thing, or how do we look at it? And as you kind of mentioned, there are countries that are sitting and saying, okay, we're going to weigh up our options. What are maybe some of those questions that a leader would be considering from a geopolitical perspective? Yeah,
and again, go back to that sort of old globalization. You didn't really have to worry about that. Now you do. So I think a starting point is, okay, where are we? Where does our tech come from? How exposed are we to any sort of economic security issues? Are we dealing with anybody on the US entity list or the Chinese entity list, and so on? So first of all, sort of, I think asking the question, how well do we understand this new environment within which we're operating? And that's a great starting point. And then I think secondary sort of questions flow from that. What sector are we in? How sensitive is it? How exposed are we to this, ongoing trade war and so on? Some of the answers to all of that at the moment are we don't know. There's
TBD,
there's too much uncertainty. So, okay, that's fine. We're not going to do anything. We're not going to make any sort of big decisions. And there's been a big hold up of CapEx because people don't want to make those decisions in this type of environment. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that time stands still. And so a lot of the sort of questions at the moment, I think, that I sort of deal with are, what is it that you can control now? Where are you on your digital transformation? Where are you on the application of AI? Where are you on sharpening your value props? All of these things you can do, you can control. And whether that's a company or a country, and you think about Canada and its relationship this year with the United States, for example, that's jolted them into thinking a lot more about actually how dependent do we want to be on the United States. They're really doubling down on their Indo-Pacific strategy, for example, to try to reduce dependency on the States and build new markets in this part of the world. For Europe, for Japan, every country and companies within that as well. Again, I think it's prescient to be thinking, what is it that you can control right now? Because a lot of this stuff you can't, and you'll just have to sort of leave that where it is until it settles down a bit. Tomorrow is August 1st. Maybe we'll get a bit more clarity on the sort of tariff regime globally vis-a-vis the United States. Perhaps not. But we should get a little bit more understanding of relative rates for different countries. This should help executives start thinking, okay, this is the new environment within which we're operating. What does it mean for us now? How can we start moving forward?
Yeah. No, it's so interesting, and especially as you said, that we are in, let's say, we do have a different imperative. But I remember, when we're like Australia, for example, after the Second World War, or during the Second World War, had horrific propaganda posters like, don't worry, the Japanese won't come because they can't get here. They ride bikes and they can't get here. Nice. Honestly, there was posters, like if you Google them, they exist. It's horrific. But now if you think about it, as you kind of mentioned, in terms of sovereignty, you don't need planes, bicycles, or any other kind of locomotive to get you anywhere. Yep. It's really this element of digitalism. And this was only, how long ago was that? It's only like 50, 60 years ago. It's not like it's, an unthinkable time, like, the medieval times or something. This was, very much within many people's lifespan. So it's certainly something very different. Is there any, would you say, one particular strategic imperative that maybe is not as forefront of mind for leaders as perhaps it should be? Is there anything that you often find nudging people to remember?
Look, I think, and this is an interesting question again, if you think about Japanese companies and US companies, we probably looked at some of this, who owns the company? Yes. And what does that mean in terms of its governance and its focus areas? I'm always astounded at the short-termism of a lot of Western companies, and particularly when you come to publicly owned, publicly traded US firms, the focus on the quarterly earnings and so on. That short-term thinking is not sustainable. You really need to be thinking longer term about the sustainability, and I'm not talking about sustainability in terms of carbon footprint, although that's critically important. The viability, commercial viability of your business in this incredibly fast-paced, geopolitically complex and tense environment. I don't think enough people have that long-term vision, which you'll be better placed to think about Japan and the sort of ownership structure that we hear. A good example, Japanese companies are often criticized for sitting on piles of cash, retained earnings and so on. In an American model, that would be returned to shareholders in dividends and or whatever, invested in R&D and so on. But it wouldn't be sitting there as a pile of cash. Now it actually looks quite sort of prescient to have that, particularly as Japanese firms seem to be eating the tariffs that they're to some extent that they have to pay, or that controls their trade with the United States, so they can maintain their market share. So I guess that's one example of sort of longer term thinking and resilience, as opposed to, and again, that makes sense today. Would that have made sense 20 years ago?
Different question.
Things change. Yeah.
Is there one particular country in the region that you're that's, I don't necessarily want to call it a dark horse, but one that you're like, they're taking a really interesting approach and they're doing some really interesting things? Is there perhaps one country, could it even be an unassuming player?
So Singapore sort of stands out, incredibly rich city-state, very smart, massive investment in innovation, R&D, attracting in global best practice, all the rest of it. So sort of leave that to one side.
I've never heard anyone say I've been to Singapore was terrible. I've never heard anyone say that.
I mean, digital government is, particularly coming from Japan, is just, it blows your mind.
Yeah.
Opening a bank account, getting a mobile phone, whatever.
I can't.
It's like stepping into the future from Japan. But looking elsewhere across Southeast Asia, just to focus on that part of the world, Vietnam is a fascinating country, and it really benefited from Trump 1.0 and the sort of outflow of firms making their China plus one strategy since nearly 10 years ago. That's been sort of ongoing. Too successful because their trade surplus with the United States, I think it became the biggest or third biggest surplus. Secondly, anyway, so they got caught in the crosshairs of Trump 2.0. But they're taking that as a competitive challenge, and they're rethinking their economy. They're dramatically deregulating, opening up, attracting in more investment, semiconductor firms and so on. And I think that's a really good example of at a country level of controlling what you can. So I'd really keep my young, educated workforce open to foreign direct investment. They've got challenges, of course, they have within their business environment.
Also very bilingual as well. Strong English as well.
Strong links with the States and so on, and with Japan, and they've got that tension with China, which is a good opportunity for Japan in terms of infrastructure, all these type of areas. So I would definitely keep my eye on that economy. Just next door, Thailand, we got the complete opposite. We got political crisis. We just had a border confrontation with Cambodia. Is there going to be a military coup at some point in not too distant future? And Thailand will probably grow at just under 2% this year, and that's shocking for an economy of that. Where it is in terms of its development. It should be double that.
Yeah, it should be, especially with the foreign direct investment and then the travels and especially also the real estate. Yeah.
Well, one other one, if I may. Malaysia is very interesting. It's building a load of data centers for China, for the United States. So it seems to be playing a very good game there. It also has strong and growing links with the GCC, the Gulf region, which is a great sort of strategic fit between that part of the world, which is going through its energy transition, which is cash rich and looking to invest in the future and so on, and ASEAN economies which are re-evaluating their own growth models. If this sort of export-led model that has led for decades in Asia, and particularly in Southeast Asia, if that's starting to run out of steam, then what's going to be the next driver of growth? Energy transition, I think, is a critical one. Building out the digital economies, and particularly when it comes to healthcare, education, delivery of services, and all the rest of it. So the couple of countries and a couple of sort of links there, I think. Yeah.
What's interesting, as much as AI is kind of this kind of magical technology that kind of lives in the outer type thing for many people, there's kind of like an over-reliance or an over-trust or an under-trust. There's no kind of, it's like, yes, you can take my retinal data and read my DNA, or it's you need to open your own private VPN in order to search, the best coffee spot in, the new city you're in or something, kind of one or the other. But we're actually seeing more and more a return to natural resources. So, for example, energy, water, things like this regarding the data centers, particularly in the States, there's massive issues around water. And so, it's for me, it's always quite interesting because, if I think about this from an industry perspective, we often say that accelerating your engineering team, but leaving everyone else in the organization, be it finance, legal, sales, or whatever, not accelerated or not AI literate, just moves the bottleneck, right? Yeah. And so for me, it's kind of perhaps a similar model where we can accelerate our technology as fast as we can, but if we're meeting issues like there's not enough water, how do we produce electricity? These are really core issues that need attention. What's your thoughts there?
Well, just really good issues and very sort of top of mind at the moment. Again, focus on sort of Southeast Asia and Indonesia. I mentioned they're building a load of data centers there, and these are very real issues around energy generation and transmission. Just to focus on that at the moment. Step back in time a bit, 97, 98, Asian financial crisis. All of those ASEAN economies realized that one way that they could grow out of that would be to come together, to integrate much more closely. And they did that through the ASEAN Free Trade Agreement, which reduced tariffs between member states down to zero. And that was, 20-something years ago. Now there's another opportunity with this sort of, I wouldn't say a crisis sort of context, but tense and complicated context that we're in, for ASEAN to be looking again at how can we deepen that integration. There are all sorts of barriers to trade, non-tariff measures and so on, which mean that intra-regional trade within ASEAN is still relatively modest, 20-something%, as opposed to 60-70% in the European Union. So, okay, that's one thing that we can start looking at, control what you can. But also energy. There are moves to create a sort of ASEAN-wide energy grid, and we have seen energy come from, Thailand, Vietnam, down to Singapore. Talk about cables from Australia through to Indonesia and up there as well. So, massive investment needed in all of this, but by doing that, you hasten the energy transition, you bring the region together, and you start to solve for some of those problems that are emerging. But these are really big infrastructure projects that we're talking about that require billions and billions in investment over years. Getting the funding worked out is it's all sort of there. Will this context that we're in now force that change to happen? That's a great question. It is super interesting in terms of having to balance this, kind of space-like future that we are imagining, but then also double-checking if we have water, and do we have enough electricity? So it's, definitely balancing that. Another kind of balancing act that comes to mind is that of industry and government. Do you have perhaps maybe it be a favorite case study or an example where this is working really well? So one thing that I found particularly interesting is that lots of the leaders of the AI companies, when you're asking them questions regarding policy, so for example, many young people are using ChatGPT as a counselor. There are structured, or there are legal frameworks in place that if you say something to either your lawyer or your counselor, that there's some kind of element of kind of freedom of speech or kind of respect of information, or I forgot the exact word. But when you're asking, for example, Sam Altman, the head of OpenAI, was asked this exact question, what do you do there? And he said, no, we don't have anything in place. And then so basically, if someone were to, let's say, get subpoenaed, or, where this information were to land in somebody else's hands, actually that's not really their problem. And so we're having these companies moving ahead at astronomical speed. When you're speaking, they're always saying the next thing is coming out. Jensen is always saying, the next, chip is coming out, and the next ChatGPT is coming out. And so they are racing ahead, and we're kind of looking at policy and sitting in the dust. Where can we find, what kind of systems could we put in place where perhaps we're building safe systems, but also not losing that speed? Do you have any? Well, I mean, this is the pressing issue when it comes to AI governance, and I think the starting point is, what's the purpose? What are you looking to do? And there seem to be, in very broad strokes, three camps there. United States, unfettered. Go for it. Go ahead. Make money. This is the way that we do things. Creative destruction, all the rest of it. China, well, we want to control this. We want to see what's going on with the data and all the rest of it. So reinforcing sort of state control, and the European Union, individual data sovereignty first and foremost. Everything needs to stem from that. So you've got these sort of competing camps going on, which, as they go through those discussions, as they think about it, hopefully deeply, and think about the sort of philosophy, the ethics of it, and so on, we get to some level where, okay, we as a region or as a country, we want to align more with this. A good example would be GDPR, that came out of Europe, which many countries around the world have adopted and said, yeah, actually that's a really good standard for us to work to. So, maybe the European Union, often derided as, over-regulated and all the rest of it, has a really good role to play in this, coming from that starting point of thinking, how do we protect the individual? Rather than, how do we make more money? Or how do we create, how can we control more of society? Personally, I would say that that's a pretty good approach to take.
So one thing that I heard that was quite interesting was, for example, the Microsoft AI reskilling program.
Yep.
So they have committed their largest investment to Japan. So not their largest investment ever, but their largest investment to Japan has been in AI infrastructure. So not only just systems and technology, but also a commitment to educating the people. And they've committed, I don't want to quote numbers because I don't want anyone to to say that's wrong, but it was a significant number of people that Microsoft has said that we're not only looking at educating our customers, but we're actually looking at educating the entire scale of people. So everyone from the mother that's in the supermarket dealing with the rice shortage at the moment and saying, I really want to feed my family. Rice is astronomically expensive. What are my other options? What are some, recipes I could make, right? All the way through to children. How are they, in this kind of like cram school culture where all you have to do is just memorize. How can they use technology? So, or even, for example, a farmer in Hokkaido, how are they dealing with things? So that's one thing that I thought was quite interesting. But this particular reskilling program is actually not led by their AI department. That's led by their corporate governance. I think it's their corporate governance or policy department, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah. No, that does sound very interesting. Good. It sounds like they've given us some thought, and at the heart of this, technology, individuals, and society, and how do you sort of square some of the challenges that come out from this. I was talking yesterday to a professor, and we were talking about how his students are using AI, and of course it's one of the biggest issues. Of course, any student can get AI to write their essay, and so you really need to then go back to a sort of system whereby you have an oral examination. Page 7, paragraph 2. you said this. Explain why. Well, why didn't you say this?
Yeah.
And if they can't, that's an F.
Yeah.
You haven't learnt anything. Better though, even better is to say, okay, AI is there. How can we use that as a tool to support our learning, to broaden our literature review and get an understanding of this, and using those tools then to help you think and then write your own original analysis. That's, I think, where the sort of shift in the education sphere needs to take place.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I was in Fukuoka and I had a professor from Kyushu Daigaku come to me and say, AI is going to make everybody stupid. I was like, okay. Because, when people have that opinion, what can you do, right? So, and I said, in my opinion, if you use AI well, it's actually one of the most physically draining mental exercises. When you use it well.
Exactly.
Because, using AI to say, hey, write something, it'll write anything. But in order for it to be you and unique, you have to really work together with it.
Yeah, I think exactly right. That's been my own experience of interacting with it and getting, so it's prompt engineering, right? Yeah. And all this, which is not my area at all, but I understand the concept of really asking very, very good questions and getting very precise with this, and then challenging it, interrogating the responses there, and validating it elsewhere. I think that there is a concern that AI can make us dumb, as any technology can. I always think about sat-nav in your car. When I was driving, when I was younger, you'd have a map on your lap, and you'd have a mental map of where you're going with markers in there. Now you just press a button and follow that, and you have no idea sort of where you are. So in that sense, I sort of get it, and people can sit on the train and play silly little games and waste time, or you could be listening to a really insightful podcast like this.
Oh, exactly. Well, that makes me laugh, because I remember I saw a joke the other day that was like, remember how we thought that access to information was the problem? It wasn't. But one thing that I'm always such a fan of yours is that despite everything that you know, despite the fact that you know that we're living on the pre-war of this and that and this and everything that could be going on politically, geopolitically, what that means for an economy, how close we are to it all being over, you're still quite a positive commentator.
I think you have to be. I mean, let's not forget that, go back to the 60s, Cuban Missile Crisis, we're that far away from nuclear war, and that would have been global devastation. I grew up in that Cold War period. A couple of movies from that time, one of them called Threads, which was an absolutely harrowing imagining of a nuclear blast on a British city and the aftermath of that. And it was, we lived with this sort of fear and concern, and that all disappeared again under that period, 1990s, early 2000s. So we sort of, humans, I think, can deal with all of this. But if you get it down to the individual level, and even at the corporate level for a lot of corporates and so on, and for governments and so on, they're all about how do we make things better? How can we make society better? How can we make sure that the elderly population get the care that they need? How can we make sure that the young kid in Indonesia is going to get the education that she needs to be able to grow and thrive? And everybody's, go back to sort of classic economics, Adam Smith, invisible hand, pushing people forward as they want better for their lives. Nobody wants worse for their lives, so I think at the aggregate level, it's all there. We just have to make sure that, yes, we understand this sort of complex environment that we're in, but we can control what we can, and we can sort of, work with individuals, with organizations for a better future. I mean, it sounds a little bit trite, but, if that's somewhere within us as we're interacting, then at the aggregate level, there's a lot of invisible hands pushing us towards a better place.
I agree. And as maybe a closing statement, what are some things that perhaps as we can maybe equip ourselves with in terms of facing change? I mean, we've faced change time and time again as humanity. Obviously, the AI front, there's a lot new, but certainly I'm sure that there's some things we can take with us. What are perhaps some frameworks that you've really enjoyed?
Maybe two, and I think we started off with that historical context and reading about change in the past. I mean, I'm a great fan of classic Victorian literature, and that period, particularly in the early 1800s onwards, the dramatic change that society went through, and reading about the lives of people at that time and how they were dealing with it, whether it's Thomas Hardy or it's Dickens, we've seen this sort of change. That's a sort of historical context. And then forward-looking, those scenarios, posing those what-if questions. What if we really do have a sort of breakthrough within energy? And what if, The Economist last week had a great sort of article there on, what if AI really does lead to a massive growth in prosperity? And it could do. But then there's sort of second kind of questions, well, who benefits from all of this? Who's capturing that value and so on? So historical context, learning from that, and then looking at all these sort of what if scenarios, I think is a good place to be.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you for joining us. I will put in the comments or in our show notes all the places that people can find you and follow you and of the new work that you're doing.
Fantastic, yeah.
Thank you so much
I
for
really
coming.
enjoyed it, yeah.
Thank you. ありがとうございました。
Great.
Thank you.
Good fun.
Thank you, thank you.
Did I press record?
Yeah.
Oh.